And as a host, you'll be controlling my voice, right?
Okay.
Ben, did you hear that? What?
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Patrice. You cannot start your video because the
Is
host
everyone?
is able to.
Oh yeah, Patrice, we're just doing audio. You don't have to be on video.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
All right. How's my voice? Everything good? All right. Well, I just wanted to say thanks, everyone, for joining us. We have a lot to cover, so I'm going to keep this very. The National Communications Director of Baji, and I will be moderating this webinar. We all know that 21 Savage is free, but his case isn't over. He and hundreds of thousands of Black immigrants faced deportation at the hands of Trump immigration force, but also before Trump, there was a criminalization and enforcement apparatus that started to ramp up. And so today, what we're going to try to do is definitely take a look at the 21 Savage case and also build some context as to how we got here. How is it that someone who was nominated for the Grammys, a very famous celebrity, a musician, was able to be caught in the dragnet of immigration customs enforcement? And also towards the end, that we hope to make a call and a demand for action for Black communities to unite to fight mass criminalization that we're going through this country right now. And I will introduce Jonathan from UndocuBlack.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this webinar today. My name is Jonathan Jace Green. I'm the co-founder and director of the UndocuBlack Network. We are a multi-generational network of undocumented Black people organizing our communities and building power. And I'm really grateful that y'all join us for this call today because we are here as part of the Free 21 Savage Coalition, a coalition anchored by the Black Lives Matter Global Network in coalition with the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, the UndocuBlack Network, Define America, and Color Change, and multiple other partners. And we came together to really fight, first of all, to free Shea from detention when he was incarcerated last week, but also to be able to build out this narrative and push out and support and fight back against the criminalization of Black immigrants across the country, and also working towards a world without immigration detention. So it's really important that we are having this conversation because from the beginning, we knew that this was not just about 21 Savage or Shea bin Abraham Joseph. This was about all of us, right? This is about how do we build a coalition that is able to support and fight for those marginalized voices and build power for all of our communities, right? And it's really important that we put his case in context to the broader Black immigrant experience. Across the country, there's 4.2 million Black immigrants and growing, right? And there's over 620,000 of us that are undocumented. And we know that those were the numbers from a couple of years ago, according to the Pew Research Center. But because of Trump's policies, I'm sure those numbers keep growing. With the recession of TPS, with the attempts to end DACA, with the end of DED for folks from Liberia, right? All these programs that Black immigrant communities have used over time, that this president continues to go after, right? I think what's really important to also highlight is that Shea's detention is really emblematic to what happens to Black immigrants every day in this country, right? So being targeted and criminalized, right? The fact that ICE was lying and using mantles of criminality to be able to sort of tear up his character and say that to justify his removal, right? Like, we see that as Black immigrant communities every day and Black people in this country, right? The fact that they were denying him bond, and once they finally granted him bond, it was so high, right? That is the experience that we as organizations, Baji, Yondaki Black, BLM, that do this work every day, these are the experiences that we see, right? So it's really important that we have this conversation about the broader coalition, the broader experience of Black immigrants, but also really tie it to what Black folks have and are experiencing in this country. So I'm really grateful to be able to be here, to be able to continue to build with y'all, and look forward to continue to fight with y'all. So I'm going to turn it over to Abraham.
Yes, thank you so much, Jonathan.
Oh, Ben, I'm sorry. Yes.
Okay. Sorry, there's a little bit of feedback, but thank you, Jonathan, for that background. And like all Black people living in this country, Black immigrants disproportionately experience racial discrimination, particularly in the form of mass criminalization. African Americans, Black immigrants experience desperate, often negative outcomes with criminalization and the incarceration and deportation regimes. And so for this next part, we're going to build context around what we call crimmigration. And what that is the intersection of the criminal legal system and the immigration enforcement system. And Ben's gonna walk us through that and give us a background of how we got here.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Benjamin Dukabuya. I'm with the Black Alliance for Just Immigration. I work as a research and advocacy manager here. And what happened at 21 Savage is as many people have said on this call, and as what has been said at the rally in Atlanta, is that this is part of a broader narrative of the reality of Black people in this country, Black immigrants recently in the last 50 to 80 years, and really, African Americans for 400 years. This is just the reality that people have been going through. And so our immigration enforcement system, it's really the story of the last 50 years, and really in particular the major changes that happened in the 90s, in the last 20 years under the Clinton administration. And so as many of you all may know or remember, in the 90s there were a series of crime bills that were put under the legislation in 92 and 94 and 96. And these bills, three of them in particular, as many of you all may remember, there was things like the 3 strikes laws, and really what kicked off and intensified the war on drugs. What many people may not know is that these were also immigration enforcement bills. And so, for example, they really transformed our immigration system in a number of ways, and really to intersect and really ground it firmly in the most racist and violent aspects of our racist criminal justice system. So, for example, under the 96 laws, they added over 50 new mandatory deportable felonies and a host of misdemeanors that could turn into felonies that would mandatorily deport someone. Before this, there was only 2 or 3 crimes that would lead to people's deportation. But as we saw increasingly African and Asian and South American migrants coming into the United States, the United States transitioned to criminalizing immigration in more intense ways than we have ever seen before. And so the adding of 50 new deportable felonies was one of those areas. And along with that, they made these laws retroactive. And so what that means is that if you were arrested for something in 91, when these laws came into effect in 92, you could still be deported for it after the fact. After you've come out of jail, after you've come out of prison, after the fact, with this conviction, you could be deported. And so it acted retroactively. And this is something really that can't be done in any in other fields of law other than immigration enforcement. These laws also took away people's right to representation, and these laws also made mandatory detention a reality, indefinite detention a reality, and it really just made mass criminalization really grounded in immigration. And so to this day, what we understand as immigration enforcement really is about criminalization. And most immigrants now to this day are removed as a product of criminal contact. And so basically their first contact is with a law enforcement or a police officer on the ground. So you see that in many ways that those who are devastated by the criminal justice system are in the same boat as those who are targeted by immigration enforcement. And so that's kind of in the 90s, the basic infrastructure of immigration law. The last major change to immigration laws that we saw were to make it, were to target Black and brown communities with high levels of enforcement. And then as we move forward from there, what we've seen is that in the budgets that are created, immigration and law enforcement are intensely combined and work hand in hand. And so we see that in cities and states all over the country that local law enforcement build strong partnerships with ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement, which is the arm of immigration that enforces deportations. And so when Trump right now, when he raises budgets for ICE, for the Department of Homeland Security, puts billions into the Department of Homeland Security, when he schedules efforts to hire thousands more ICE officers, thousands more Border Patrol officers, ICE then takes these dollars and then transfers these dollars and pours it into local law enforcement. And they pour into local law enforcement because they want to be able to share information with local law enforcement on who's there, who's living in those communities. And then also they take that money and they train local law enforcement to target immigrant communities. So what ends up happening is that anti-immigrant money, anti-immigrant dollars to facilitate deportations is given to ICE, and ICE gives it to local law enforcement that then target the whole Black community. So often you will see even African Americans are getting arrested or targeted by immigration customs enforcement officers. One example of that being the story of Terrence Killam, a Detroit native who was killed by police. So that is the context and the reality of how Black immigrant and particularly African American communities are often, when it comes to budgets, are in the same boat. Immigration enforcement dollars lead to jailing and arrests of everyone, of the entire Black community, and also facilitates deportations for Black immigrants. And also, because we're across Congress, whether we're talking about Democrat or Republican or even locally, the way this is paid for, the billions of dollars increase in the Department of Homeland's budgets or ICE's budget, that is paid for not by raising taxes, but by cutting social services. So we're talking about HUD, we're talking about Department of Education, we're talking about all of the services that we desperately need in our communities. And these are the same services that were created or expanded by the Civil Rights Movement. And so what we understand at Baji is that anti-immigrant sentiment and policy is a unique strategy that Trump is using to roll back the gains of the Civil Rights Movement, which has been the policy goal in the United States for the last 50 years. And immigration is just one aspect of that. And so being able not only to fight back against criminalization and the billions of dollars that goes into policing and cages locally and federally, but also demanding that these resources be brought back to our community to really build strong communities, to give us housing and education, to make sure that everybody has a home and make sure everyone has high quality education, and to make sure people have all of their needs met. That is how we define safety and how we define strong communities where people have their needs met. And so this is kind of the basic building blocks of how we unite our communities. And with that being said, I would like to turn it over to Abe and just before I turn it over to Abe, one other thing I wanted to add is that as a consequence of the 96 laws and the increasing of enforcement on immigration and the fusing of ICE and local police in a number of cities and countries like Atlanta across the country, Black immigrants have become the community that has the highest level of criminal alien deportation and also criminal alien detention. So as a consequence of criminal contact, Black immigrants are more represented than any other community in detention and deportation proceedings. So Black immigrants make about 5% of the undocumented community, but 1 out of every 5 people who's deported or detained as a product of criminal contact is Black. And so these are the same kind of dynamics you see in the criminal justice system is similar to what you see in immigration enforcement. And these systems work hand in hand as part of the broader system of criminalization to target and dismantle Black communities. With that being said, I'll pass it over to Abe to talk about how Trump uniquely has targeted Black communities.
Thank you so much, Ben, and for that great background. And just to sort of wrap up, what Ben has been explaining is that there has been this apparatus that has been growing in this country for a very, very long time. And the last time there was any major immigration law that has changed was 1996. And since then, whether it was comprehensive immigration reform or whether it was, sort of the Gang of Eight proposal, no law has changed. There has been policies, an executive order policies that essentially encourages law enforcement to criminalize against us. And I'm going to spend a couple minutes talking about that. In general, right now, there is an incredible amount of investment going into criminalizing Black communities, even as crime rates have declined all across the country. So the expansion of local police departments or the expansion of law enforcement feeds deportation. So when we get more police and when we're in the courts more and when we're in the prisons more, we get more deportation. And as Trump increases the budget for interior enforcement, which is essentially ICE or Customs Border Patrol, that money essentially funnels into local law enforcement. And with that money, police then target all Black communities. President Trump inauguration, within weeks, he had signed essentially some major executive orders. Now, again, these executive orders do not change the law. The laws are still on the books. But what it sort of shows is that it intensifies the criminalization of Black people and further encourages over-policing and violence by the police in our communities. There is a case of Terrence Cullum, who was shot by an ICE officer in Detroit during a joint operation. And we start to see a lot more of this violence that essentially arrested Shea, and all communities, Black communities across the country are suffering from it. The major executive order that was signed was called Enhancing Public Safety in the Interior of the United States. And so the name doesn't really mean that much, but what it did is that it expanded the detention and deportation pipeline by expanding cooperation with local police. And there is a lot of fuzziness about how 21 Savage was apprehended, but we do strongly feel that it is a direct result of this cooperation with the police. These executive orders were, I guess, sadly and ironically signed during Black History Month in 2017, and it gave police a lot more powers. Trump is essentially leveraging this public perception that crime is on the rise and that the backlash against protesters, activists, grassroots efforts, and even immigrants, that there needs to be a ramp up of policing efforts, and executive actions in these executive orders like these only worsen the continued criminalization of Black and brown people. These orders essentially address a problem that doesn't exist. It provides sort of a new strategy that punish those who commit or attempt lies essentially against violence against law enforcement. And because people of color, because Black and brown people, particularly masculine presenting Black people in particular, are often profiled and misperceived as violent, there is this increased focus on heightened anxiety about violence against police. The second major executive order was on, the name of it is Enforcing Federal Law with Respect to Transnational Criminal Organizations. Now that, again, the name isn't really important what effect that it has sort of on the country. It essentially calls for the swift removal of non-citizens, and it basically adds more punishment to their offenses. And so what we're starting to see, particularly under Trump, is beyond the rhetoric that we sort of see on, in the media, that there is actually executive orders and policies that are being signed that embolden local police officers and ICE and CBP to essentially go bananas on our communities, to say it in another way. I know that Thomas Holdman at one point, who was the director of ICE, during an interview, and I believe it was on Fox, basically has said sadistically that the shackles are off on ICE officers. And so across the country, what we are seeing is this impact of policing courts and prisons onto the Black and brown communities, but in particular to Black immigrants, and this disturbing level of cooperation, right, puts Black immigrants at risk of deportation who have any encounter with the local police, and that they may be at risk of deportation. To bring it closer to home with the 21 Savage Coalition, we are also going to bring up Clarissa Brooks. And just to give people just a little bit of a quick fact around what has been happening in Atlanta, for example, roughly 13% of the city's operating budget is for the police and corrections department, while only 3% of that goes to the Department of Community Development, affordable housing, and after-school programs. In the immigration context, the Atlanta City Council in 2017 did pass what was considered a symbolic resolution to restrict collaboration between the Atlanta Police Department or the Georgia Police Department, the local ones, with ICE. And so the question then is, if this resolution exists, why was Shea picked up? And as of recently, as of last night, the Congressional Black Caucus issued a letter, and would be more than happy to sort of share that letter, raising alarm around 21 Savage's arrest, but more importantly, expressing alarm around the heightened rhetoric and the destructive policies in Georgia. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to Clarissa Brooks.
Hey everyone. So I'm Clarissa Brooks. I am a community organizer in Atlanta, and I work within a student organization called AUC Shut It Down. So thank you so much, Abe, for giving that context. It's really important. So the mandate legislation that was passed through the city council by Keisha Lance Bottoms is pretty symbolic in nature. Basically, it says that the city of Atlanta jail won't accept any more ICE detainees. But what that doesn't mean is that the state of Georgia won't, and that state prisons won't take them either. So Georgia has one of the highest concentrations of ICE detention centers in the Southeast, next to Louisiana and Texas. So in that way, it kind of pushed immigration outside the city, the issue itself, but that doesn't change the fact that Black immigrants are still being arrested at higher numbers. And as we've spoken about, ICE and APD still do get similar funding. So in Keisha Lance Bottoms' first 100 days in office, she called for pay raises for APD and also mandated an extra $90 million to that budget. And that budget also included ICE, regardless of the jail mandate. So the money that is being used to terrorize and kill Black folks is also being used to detain and harass Black immigrant folks as well. So since we know that, I think that it was really important for us on the ground here to do a rally for 21 for Shea's family, because we see that this is definitely a Black issue. And in the context of Atlanta, especially with how huge the hip hop industry is here, folks, Black undocumented folks, as being a part of Blackness in whatever monolithic way that we see it. But we know that it's real, and we know that it's an issue that we need to address. And thankfully the rally went really well. A lot of folks showed out. 21's folks came, and we were able to kind of give people more context on how these institutions really don't care about Black undocumented folks, Shea and others included. Just our interactions with the ICE office was pretty hostile. So I think it kind of brought to people's faces the reality that, like, this is something we need to work on constantly. And then also bringing in the local aspect of it. Deasha Griffin and Jimmy Atchison were killed by APD this year, by APD, both unarmed. So we can see how APD, getting their funding from ICE, using similar practices, whether it be tasing, harassing, all those things, everything is connected in understanding what the work looks like to abolish ICE and demilitarize the police, especially in Atlanta. I think a lot of times, because Atlanta is known as a Black city, folks think that we don't have issues in regards to policing, and that because we have a mayor named Keisha, that we have resolved racism, and that is not true. Anti-Blackness is global, and it is everywhere, and it affects all of us. So seeing that we are in a state like Georgia with Brian Kemp as our governor, I think it's important that we continue to push fighting for undocumented folks. I know for myself, this was my first time specifically working in this area, but it's definitely something that I want to uplift constantly in the work that I do, and I'm super grateful for Baji for including us.
Thank you so much. And really appreciate that, Clarissa. Great work on the ground. You know, a lot of this is really about having our communities and our people sort of in the streets and being able to relay what is happening in real time and what is happening to our people. And condolences to the two brothers that have passed and to their families. And I just really want to stress that, you know, what we see in the media and what folks will say, oh, this is just rhetoric. What are the sort of consequences? And the consequences are essentially, you know, bodies in the street, funerals, folks having to mourn, you know, Black bodies as it is. And so with that sort of segue of Black bodies, I really want to introduce the illustrious Patrice from the Black Lives Matter Global Network. Oh, but before we do that, do folks have any questions and answers of what folks have heard, either from Jonathan, Clarissa, Ben, or me?
So yeah, I see one question, if y'all don't mind me answering it. The question is from Catherine, and it says, are you aware of the 3-year plan to implement the Nordic model in Atlanta? They're increasing police targeting sex workers. Various companies are going to be racially profiling people and surveilling their customers. I do not know what the Nordic model is, but I do know that with the Super Bowl, we saw an increase of the policing and targeting of Black sex workers. And we also know that APD in the city arrested basically all of the homeless people on quality of life charges. So yeah, we're definitely aware that they're increasing policing as Atlanta is trying to move towards being a global city and getting more large events like the Super Bowl. So we have to think about that in the context of talking about Black undocumented folks, and how when we see a rise in APD, we also see a rise in the arrest of Black undocumented folks from ICE as well.
Yeah, I think that, thank you for that, Clarissa. This has been with Baji. I think ultimately, just to reiterate what Clarissa is saying, that policing as a form of safety is always going to be violent towards Black people. And so we have always understood that whether we're talking about sex work, whether we're talking about people who are dealing with any number of trauma, that the policing doesn't create safety, it actually increases the violence that they're facing. And so one of our commitments is to redefine what safety is for our community. We want people to really think about divesting from policing as a form of safety, and think of safety as a function of well-resourced, organized communities. That when you are in a neighborhood that's safe, when you're in a community that's safe, it's usually a place not only where people have their needs met, but people are proactively addressing safety on the ground and are well organized to address it. And so that's how, particularly when it comes to sex work, the answer being policing. We've seen here in the United States, in Europe, as a lot of African migrants go to Europe, we've seen that sex work increasingly is criminalized. A lot of Black women, Black LGBT folks who are coming to the United States and then going to Europe are criminalized as a function of sex work. And obviously here in the United States, the long tradition of targeting Black people who are sex workers is ongoing. And so I think, Catherine, we really thank you for that question, because ultimately that really shows that policing, whether you're addressing any type of issue, has never created safety for our community in any meaningful way. Any other questions, folks? We have another question coming in over the phone. One of the questions is, what are some ways that we can see, we can imagine Black communities across the diaspora coming together to address mass criminalization? And I'm going to unmute all of our panelists so that they can address it as they see fit. So the question is, how can Black communities come together to address mass criminalization?
I'll go ahead and answer. I think Patrice would be could give some much greater context to this. But I think addressing anti-Blackness in the Black community is really important. And also just, you know, I feel like Black folks, in the regard of like African American folks, have a very monolithic idea of what Blackness is. So even in conversations about Shaya's arrest, a lot of folks were like, where is he from? What does this mean? So I think we just gotta address anti-Blackness and really address the fact that like Black folks can be from different countries, and that migrant stories of Black folks are a part of it. So yeah, I think just calling a thing what it is, and making space for folks, because a lot of people had a hard time wrapping their head around this. But I think that's kind of the political education work we need to do to make sure we're getting not just monolithic ideas of Blackness from media.
Absolutely. This is Abraham with Baji again, and I echo the sentiments that Clarissa also had said. I also do think, just as work needs to be done in the African American community, there's also work that needs to be done in the Black immigrant community with anti-Blackness, and also understanding that the history of this country, what Black folks have struggled through, needs to be beyond just acknowledged and recognized, but respected with honor, so that as we move forward towards the fight against white supremacy, is to understand that there has been the Black community here, organic, you know, native in one way or another to these problems and issues, particularly around police brutality, particularly around criminalization. And so I think that the goal for, you know, sort of these webinars, the 21 Savage, is to have that, albeit uncomfortable conversation, but a conversation that really needs to say that, look, we are, you know, struggling in poverty together. Our kids are going to the same schools and are learning things that essentially makes us hate ourselves. Our healthcare is horrible. Our unemployment rate at one point or another will be about the same. And so we're all sort of getting locked up together. We're all struggling together. We're all being oppressed together. And to find ways of common goals that basically say we can, you know, our liberation just as our oppression is tied together. And so I think it begins with this conversation that really shows respect for both. And the next question is by Manuela. Any connections to the hardening of schools and connections between ICE and school communities? And I think the best person for this conversation, for this question, is Ben.
Thank you, Abe. The connection between ICE and schools is something that has been worked on, particularly in the South, for a long time. And the reality is that whenever you see policing in schools, also you see the impact of ICE as well, and the facilitating and pushing people who are young people, and later on in their lives as young adults into detention, deportation proceedings. And so You've seen in places like Atlanta and many other cities, New York and Oakland and Miami and all of these places, a lot of school districts that put police in school, and particularly in Black communities, where Black young people are not given childhoods, but are seen as criminal even from childhood. And this started not with the school. I mean, a lot of people think of the school to prison pipeline now as a kind of a function of the 90s. But we see, even you go back to 68, 67, when a lot of schools were integrating, is that when Black young people were going to school, they would protest the racism within schools as they were integrating, and that facilitated bringing police to schools and schools getting their own law enforcement. And that dovetailed, of course, with the insertion of ICE. And as ICE began working closely with schools, you see that then Black immigrant young people are particularly vulnerable, because often teachers do not see them as immigrants. So even in schools where teachers and administrators are really cognizant of the vulnerability of immigrants, if you have young people who are Black, people will not see them as immigrant, and often will not protect them in the same way that non-Black immigrant young people are protected. And so that's definitely, Manuela, we really appreciate that question. I think what we need to do is really begin to deepen and think about the school to deportation pipeline, which is a real reality for Black young people. And also really begin to make concerted efforts to remove all law enforcement out of schools, and really reimagine what schooling can be altogether as a place, a learning environment that helps young people thrive. But thank you for that question.
Okay, thank you so much, Ben. And the next question is, how can Black and Brown communities address these issues? How can both groups come together and work together to spread awareness about these issues and ways to find solutions? So if any of the panelists would like to jump in, Patrice, I feel like would probably be best for this.
Sure. Thanks for that. I think, this conversation around how we address community needs has a lot to do with being in conversation with the community. So part of the sort of call to action around 21, of course, it was about, supporting him and his family, but it's work that we do all the time in supporting families and communities impacted by state violence, impacted by deportation and mass incarceration. And there's a element of our work that is about rapid response, right? So like we respond to the crisis and doing crisis management, and then there's all the pieces around what it means to organize and make sure that we are challenging the state and moving forward our agenda as the state is trying to move forward their agenda. And I think as we continue to work together and be in relationship to each other, we get to see, our contradictions come out, and then we can deal with them and work through them and talk about them. But I think some of the most powerful work that I've done in community that is, in across gender, cross race, cross immigration status, has been centering it inside our work and making that be at the center of how we deal with our conflict or deal with the issues that we have with each other's communities. So that to me is like one of the answers to how we hold space for.
Yeah, and thank you, Patrice. This is Jonathan, and I wholeheartedly agree with that. And I also feel like part of this work is also about relationships, right? Like, as we're doing like cross-racial, cross-ethnic work, we need to be frank and honest about like the history of anti-Blackness and white supremacy and how we've been in relationship to each other. And some of the ways that we at Undocu Black have been able to do that, we've had a long-standing relationship and partnership with an organization called NACASEC, and they're the National Association, and I'm going to get their acronym wrong, but they organize Korean and Asian American communities. And initially, our work started out of like sort of like the rapid response moments, like working on DACA and TPS. But for us, it just really became very clear that we couldn't develop a long-term, lasting, real relationship without doing some of the political education necessary to address, right, and educate folks and make sure that, we're able to break down some of those practices and some of those beliefs to then be able to be in long-term meaningful partnership, right? So that's look like doing workshops, within our different communities and sort of them acknowledging their need to really do work on like anti-Blackness to then be able to work with us. But it's really come out of like a really genuine, like, we realize that like, as immigrant communities, as like people of color in this country, like, there is a system of white supremacy that is actively working against us, right? But then, to be able to fight back and to be able to win, right? We need to be able to be in coalition with each other, and that can't happen until we have the conversations about political education and then build meaningful relationships to then be able to act politically.
Thank you, Patrice, and thank you, Jonathan. And I love the fact that that answer really comes from the heart and it comes from the work that's being done on the ground. And this is where our solutions sort of lie in, and not in other spaces, the spaces in which people are actually building relationships and are in coalition together, and also understanding that the energy and resources that white supremacy has is immense, but it isn't unwinnable. And speaking about wins, I think that I want to sort of pivot this over to Patrice, who has been sort of, the head of this Free 21 Savage machine, to be able to sort of talk a little bit about the coalition and to be able to give us updates and thoughts about where to go forward with this energy and momentum that we have.
Thank you, team. So good to be on. Thank you for the folks who joined. We're like 30 strong or something on this call, and that's really good, really smart. Really hopeful. So, a little bit about the genesis of the Free 21 Savage Coalition is a few of us got word from his, support staff that he had been detained by ICE. And those of us who were alerted, quickly contacted movement folks, Color of Change, Baji, and DocuBlack Network, Alita from Ford, to try to do what we do around, defending our community members. This is not anything, unfortunately, new for us. And so we also saw it as an opportunity to have a larger conversation around Black immigrants and Black folks who are undocumented. And Shea was detained for 9 days. Some of that, just so folks know, is that the ICE was really bent on not letting him out, and in fact, really ready to deport him pretty immediately, all based off of them, the assumption of him being a quote criminal. So we rallied around changing the messaging. So many folks on the call remember that the very beginning messaging was humiliating messaging, right? Like making fun of him for being from the UK. It was a really narrow understanding of what Blackness is. And we changed that. And we got to see multiple folks in our movement share articles, go on TV, get on the radio. Beautiful article in Rewire with Undocumented Black Network folks. And so just changing the narrative about like who Shea is, and also who are all these other Black people who are immigrants and undocumented. I thought that was really, really powerful. And then also calling on Black Americans in particular to be in allyship with our fellow siblings. We found out while we were doing the petition drop in Atlanta, while we dropped the mic video that showed the 20 on mic.com, a powerful video with celebrities and community members talking about all the ways different people have been deported. And they're highlighting Black immigrant, Black undocumented folks too. And we found out that Shea was being released on bond. And so this took a big coalition effort. This took, you know, the legal team, it took the organizers, it took the PR and comms. It was a really important move towards being able to see what it looks like to have as many people as possible in support of someone who is vulnerable. And at this moment, he's still awaiting deportation proceedings, so we have to wait. We don't know when the bond hearing is. We don't know if it makes sense for us to even go, but he does get to fight his fight on the outside, which is, most people know, is incredible. And so many people, you know, are detained in ICE custody, sometimes indefinitely. And so this idea that he gets to be home with his family, his kids, and try to fight this case has become incredibly important. And with that, it's become increasingly important for all of us, and for me in particular, someone who's, you know, started a network that is about Black people, to also align ourselves with other Black folks who don't have Shaya's you know, name and celebrity and fame, that we fight for them too, and really following the lead of groups like Undocumented Black Network and Baji to tell us the way, and be in solidarity and be in support and right relationship with our movement leaders who are doing this work on a daily basis.
Thank you so much, Patrice. And, you know, it was great working with you. You did a great job getting a whole coalition and a group together. Jonathan with Undocu Black, shout out to Color of Change, also Define American. And, you know, last but definitely not least, like Clarissa, and the sort of just on the ground beautiful action that had happened. And I think it was right and beautiful that Shea got bond that day. And I think it goes to show sort of people power and the energy that we really do have to be able to connect with our loved ones who are behind the wall. We're wrapping up, you guys, and I just want to thank all the attendees and the participants for you know, hanging with us and being able to come to a space in which we are really unpacking a lot of the real issues that we are going through. We are extremely grateful for Shea, his family, and that he is reunited, particularly the children, get to see daddy again. And we, you know, sort of wish him rest. But for those of us that are in this work, you know, we're at it again, you know, tomorrow, and we will continue to sort of fight for what we know is a winnable fight, and a way that we bring Black people against all odds, against all the struggles that we have to go through, to understand that we organize and advocate for us. And whether, you know, the amounts of celebrities that there are is a very, very small percentage, extremely small percentage. And the folks that we really fight, you know, are for our communities that are actually, you know, raising the new generation to be able to fight for justice for all Black people. And we understand that our community does not need to be policed. We don't need to be surveilled. We don't need to be oppressed. What we do need is resources that actually make our communities healthy and safe. And, you know, holler at us whenever you can, I guess, you know, baji.org, Undocu Black, Black Lives Matter Global Network. We are around to answer your questions, and we are around to sort of work with folks in partnership. And, you know, we are in a space where we might not need allies right now. We need family and friends. Thank you so much. And I'm going to hand it over to Ben to just work out the logistics.
Hey everybody, thank you again. As Abe said, thank you for all for coming. We will, all of you will get this presentation, the PowerPoint, and then we'll also send you, this recording will be going on YouTube shortly, and all of you will be able to access it and share it as best as you can. Thank you all for coming, and have a good night.